Title: Cheating Exposed. How my surprise revealed her affair with her boss on a business trip. My name is Jim, and I'm 35 years old. I work as a project manager for a mid-sized construction company. It's not the most glamorous career, but it's steady and fulfilling. I'm the kind of guy who thrives on structure, building timelines, managing budgets, and making sure everything stays on track. That's just who I've always been: dependable, grounded, a planner. I guess that's part of what made Casey notice me in the first place. Casey is 30, my wife of 4 years, and the polar opposite of me in many ways. She works in marketing for a luxury travel company, where her days are filled with high-stakes presentations, glamorous events, and jet-setting clients. Her world is fast-paced, unpredictable, and full of excitement. It's a lifestyle that suits her perfectly. She's ambitious, creative, and has a natural charisma that makes people want to be around her. I've always admired that about her, even if it sometimes made me feel like the quieter one in our partnership. We've been together for 6 years, but I can still remember the moment I first laid eyes on her like it was yesterday. It was at a party hosted by a mutual friend. She walked in wearing a short red dress that hugged her in all the right places, her long chestnut hair cascading in waves over her shoulders. Her green eyes sparkled, and her smile, God, that smile, made it impossible to look away. She carried herself with such confidence, like she knew exactly how captivating she was. I remember standing across the room, watching her laugh at something someone had said, and thinking, I have to meet her. When our eyes met, she gave me this sly smile, like she could read my mind. That was it. I was hooked. By the end of the night, I had her number, and from then on, my life was never the same. Casey has a way of making everything feel vibrant. She brought a kind of energy and spontaneity into my life that I didn't even know I was missing. While I was busy sticking to plans and routines, she was the one who convinced me to take spur-of-the-moment road trips or dance in the kitchen just because our favorite song came on the radio. She's magnetic, the kind of woman who lights up every room she enters. But Casey isn't just beautiful, though she undeniably is. She's the kind of beautiful that turns heads wherever we go. Her long legs, toned from years of yoga and Pilates, seem to go on forever. Her face is striking, with high cheekbones, piercing green eyes, and a smile that could stop traffic. And then there's the way she dresses. Always bold, always attention-grabbing. She loves wearing fitted dresses with plunging necklines, skirts that flirt with the line of decency, and heels that make her seem taller and even more statuesque than she already is. I can't count the number of times I've noticed men staring at her. It happens everywhere: restaurants, grocery stores, even when we're just out walking. But it's at the gym where it's the most blatant. Casey loves working out. She spends hours at the gym every week, and her body shows it. She's lean, strong, and effortlessly toned. She prefers leggings that hug her curves like a second skin and sports bras that leave little to the imagination. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the sight of her like that, but it's hard not to feel possessive when I see the way other men look at her. I've caught their stares, the way they watch her like predators circling prey. It's not subtle. Sometimes they don't even bother pretending. I'll see them stop mid-rep just to gawk as she walks by. It's infuriating, and I've brought it up with her more than once. Maybe tone it down a little? I said once as we left for dinner. She was wearing a dress that clung to her in a way that was impossible to ignore. You don't like it? She asked, tilting her head as if she couldn't imagine why. It's not that, I sighed. It's just, you see the way they look at you. It's like they're undressing you with their eyes. She rolled her eyes and gave me a playful smile. Jim, it's just attention. It doesn't mean anything. You know I only love you. What could I say to that? She always had a way of disarming me with her charm. Our sex life, though, was something else entirely. Casey wasn't just passionate. She was insatiable. She wanted me as much as I wanted her, and it was like we couldn't get enough of each other. It wasn't just the frequency, though that was impressive. It was the intensity, the thrill of it. We had this almost addictive connection, and Casey thrived on pushing boundaries. Sometimes it felt like she got a rush from the risk of being caught. There were times when she'd pull me into a dark corner of a public park at night, whispering something filthy in my ear, and I couldn't say no. We'd done it in fitting rooms, in the car parked outside a restaurant, even once on the rooftop of our old apartment building. She loved the danger of it, and her boldness was intoxicating. At home, life was simpler. Casey loved to cook, though she wasn't exactly a master chef. Our kitchen often looked like a battlefield of spices and half-finished experiments, but I didn't mind. She had this way of laughing off her mistakes that made everything feel lighthearted. We'd spend evenings curled up on the couch, watching our favorite shows or planning future vacations. But as perfect as it all seemed, there were cracks, small ones. But there, Casey's job required a lot of travel, and while I was proud of her success, it meant she was gone more often than not. At first, it was just a couple of days here and there, then a week, then longer. Every time she left, we'd make the most of our time together beforehand. Our last night before one of her trips always felt like an unspoken ritual, passionate, desperate, like we were trying to fit a week's worth of love into a single night. When she'd return, she'd always bring gifts and stories of her adventures. But lately, something felt off. She'd come home looking radiant, but her focus wasn't entirely on me. I'd catch her glancing at her phone more often, smiling at messages she didn't share with me. When I asked who it was, she'd brush it off. Just work, she'd say with a quick kiss. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Casey loved me. I knew that. She told me all the time, in her words and in the way she pulled me close at night. But there was a gnawing feeling in my gut that I couldn't quite shake. And so, it was time for yet another business trip. Casey stood at the door, her suitcase waiting beside her, and she looked breathtaking as always. She wore a fitted white blouse, unbuttoned just enough to show a teasing glimpse of lace, and a pencil skirt that hugged her curves like it was tailored specifically for her. Her heels clicked lightly on the tile floor as she turned toward me, her lips curling into a playful smile. "Don't give me that look, Jim," she teased, tilting her head as her long chestnut hair spilled over one shoulder. "I'll be back in a week. You can survive 7 days without me, can't you?" I didn't answer right away. My eyes traced over her, drinking in the sight of her like a man who knew he was about to starve. "You make it sound easy," I said, my voice a little hoarse. "But you know damn well it's not." She took a step closer, her heels clicking, and slipped her arms around my neck. "Poor Jim," she whispered, her lips brushing against my ear. "How will you manage without me?" Her scent, sweet, floral, intoxicating, washed over me, and suddenly, I couldn't think about anything except having her, right there and then. She must have felt the shift in my mood because her teasing grin turned to something more dangerous, more inviting. "Casey," I started, but before I could finish, she pressed her lips against mine, and the world tilted. We didn't even make it to the bedroom. Somewhere between desperate kisses and hurried whispers, we stumbled to the living room. She tugged me down onto the plush rug, her hands already fumbling with the buttons of my shirt. I didn't care about the neighbors, though I should have. Casey had this effect on me. A pull so strong it felt like gravity, dragging me into her orbit, consuming every rational thought. Our passion only seemed to grow more reckless over the years. No matter how often we were together, it always felt like the first time. Wild, urgent, and insatiable. That day was no different. Somewhere amidst the chaos, her heel caught the edge of the full-length mirror by the wall. It teetered for a moment before crashing to the floor, shattering into a dozen sharp fragments. I froze, breathing heavily, and looked at her. Her hair was wild, her blouse undone, and her lips swollen from our kisses. She burst into laughter, her green eyes sparkling with amusement. "Do you think the neighbors heard that?" she asked, gasping between giggles. "Or do you think they'll call the police this time?" I shook my head, laughing despite myself. "If they didn't hear the mirror, they definitely heard us," I said, pulling her close again. "We really need to stop breaking things." She smirked, running her fingers through my hair. "Maybe we just need sturdier furniture." I didn't want to let her go, but the clock was ticking. By the time we managed to compose ourselves, clean up the shattered mirror, and get her bags to the car, we were running late. The drive to the airport was quiet, save for her humming along to the soft tunes on the radio. She looked out the window, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with the hem of her skirt. I couldn't help stealing glances at her, trying to memorize every detail before she left. When we arrived, I grabbed her suitcase and walked her to the terminal. She turned to me, her eyes bright but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "You know I'll miss you," she said softly, leaning in to kiss me one last time. "I know," I replied. "Just try not to drive the hotel staff crazy." She laughed, squeezing my hand before letting go. "I'll try my best." And with that, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there for a moment, watching her go, before finally turning to leave. The first day without her always felt the worst. The house was too quiet, the bed too empty. I tried to distract myself with work, errands, anything to keep my mind off the fact that she wasn't there. By the next morning, I was already restless. I decided to hit the gym, hoping a good workout would clear my head. As I was finishing my last set, a couple of my friends joined me. Alex, always the instigator, grinned at me as he picked up a set of weights. "So, Jim," he said casually, "Casey's on another trip, huh?" "Yeah," I replied, wiping sweat from my brow. "She's out for the week." "You ever thought about surprising her?" he asked, his tone light but teasing. I raised an eyebrow. "Surprising her how?" Alex shrugged. "You know, showing up unannounced. Women love that stuff. It's romantic. Plus, wouldn't it be fun to see her face when you walk into her hotel room?" I laughed, shaking my head. "I don't know. She's got work, and I don't want to mess that up." Another friend, Mike, chimed in. "Come on, Jim. She'd love it. Besides, think of the stories you'd have to tell. Just hop on a plane and sweep her off her feet. It's not like you've got anything better to do this week." Their words stayed with me long after I left the gym. The idea of surprising Casey was tempting. Spending a few days together instead of being apart sounded perfect. By the time I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The house felt even emptier that evening. Her clothes still hung neatly in the closet. Her scent lingered faintly in the air, but she wasn't there. That was all it took to make up my mind. I sat down at my laptop and started searching for flights. Within minutes, I had a ticket booked. The flight was early the next morning, and I hadn't told Casey a thing. Part of me wondered if I should call her, let her know I was coming, but I decided against it. A surprise was a surprise. After all, packing was quick. I didn't need much, just a few changes of clothes, my toiletries, and a sense of adventure I hadn't felt in a long time. As I zipped up my bag, I couldn't help imagining the look on her face when I walked into her hotel room. I was in bed early that night, though I barely slept. My mind raced with excitement, anticipation, and the smallest hint of nervousness. By the time my alarm went off, I was already awake. The airport was buzzing with early morning travelers, and I blended into the crowd, clutching my boarding pass and trying to keep my grin from splitting my face. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been this excited about something. As the plane took off, I stared out the window, the clouds below stretching endlessly into the horizon. Somewhere on the other side of the country, Casey was busy with her meetings, completely unaware that her husband was on his way. I could hardly wait to see her. When I landed, the city was buzzing with the usual chaos of a busy airport. Business travelers rushed past with their carry-ons, families wrangled excited kids, and announcements echoed overhead. I barely noticed any of it. My mind was focused entirely on Casey and the surprise I had planned. The cab ride to the hotel felt like an eternity. The streets were alive with activity, but I couldn't care less about the sights or the rhythm of the city. All I could think about was seeing her face when I showed up unannounced. I pictured her reaction, the way her eyes would light up, the way she'd throw her arms around me in delight. The hotel Casey had mentioned was a sleek, modern building that screamed luxury. Its grand entrance and gleaming marble floors looked like something out of a magazine. I checked in at the front desk, keeping things casual so as not to arouse suspicion. "One room, just for me," I said with a smile. The receptionist handed me my key card, and I made my way to my room. It was on a different floor from where I assumed Casey was staying, but I didn't want to risk running into her just yet. I wanted the surprise to be perfect. After dropping off my bag and freshening up, I sat on the edge of the bed, going over my plan. The problem was, I didn't know her room number. I'd thought about calling her, pretending I was back home, and trying to coax it out of her, but that felt wrong. I wanted this to be spontaneous, genuine. Instead, I decided to head back to the reception desk. The same receptionist was still there, a young man with a polite but distracted demeanor. "Excuse me," I said, leaning on the counter. "I'm looking for someone staying here. My wife, actually. She's here on a business trip, but I don't know her room number. I wanted to surprise her." He gave me a cautious look, clearly unsure if he should share that information. "I understand if you can't give it to me," I added quickly. "But she's hard to miss. Long chestnut hair, stunning green eyes, and a smile that can stop traffic. Honestly, she's probably the most beautiful woman in the building." The receptionist blinked, then glanced at his computer screen. "I think I know who you mean." I smiled, relieved. "Great. Can you let me know her room number?" He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Sir, I can't just give out that information. It's against policy." I sighed and reached into my pocket, pulling out a $50 bill. I folded it neatly and slid it across the counter. His eyes flicked to the cash and then back to me. "Look," I said, lowering my voice. "I'm her husband. This isn't anything shady. I just want to surprise her. Please." After a moment of hesitation, he took the bill and typed something into his system. His brow furrowed as he read the screen, and he seemed even more unsure now. "Well," he said slowly, "I can confirm she's here, but she's not alone." The words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean, not alone?" "There's a man staying in the room with her," he said, glancing at me nervously. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my hands clenched involuntarily at my sides. "Thank you," I said stiffly, turning away. My legs felt heavy as I walked toward the elevators. A man? There had to be some mistake. Maybe it was a coworker or some sort of mix-up. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my gut told me otherwise. I rode the elevator up to her floor and found a quiet spot to wait where I could see her room. My heart was pounding, each beat echoing in my ears. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, my thoughts racing. Every laugh, every glance she'd shared with male coworkers suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. Was I overthinking? Or had my instincts been screaming at me all along? Finally, the door to her room opened. Casey stepped out, laughing softly at something the man beside her had said. My breath caught in my throat. There she was, as radiant as ever, her green eyes sparkling, her hair cascading in loose waves around her shoulders. And there, holding her hand, was her boss. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. They walked down the hallway hand in hand, oblivious to everything around them, including me. Her laugh, so familiar, so intoxicating, felt like a dagger to my chest. They looked like a couple, not colleagues. I stayed rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mix of disbelief and rage. When they disappeared around the corner, I sank onto a nearby bench. My mind raced, replaying everything I'd just seen. Her boss, the same man she'd brushed off as a harmless flirt, was here, in her hotel room, holding her hand. It didn't make sense. This wasn't the Casey I knew, the Casey I loved. Time blurred as I sat there, trying to piece together the shards of my broken reality. When I finally looked up, they were walking back toward the room, still holding hands, still laughing as if the world revolved around them. They stopped outside the door, and he leaned in to kiss her. She didn't hesitate, meeting him halfway with a smile that had once been mine. I turned away, unable to watch anymore. The sight of them together burned into my memory like a brand. When I heard the door close, I stood and approached their room. My feet felt like lead, my chest tight with anger and hurt. I didn't knock, didn't burst in. Instead, I stood outside, my fists clenched as I struggled to think clearly. What was I supposed to do? Confront them? Wait for them to leave again? Call her out in front of the hotel staff? 1,000 scenarios ran through my mind, but none of them felt right. I needed a plan, something that would make her face what she'd done, what they'd done. But as I stood there, the weight of betrayal settled over me like a suffocating fog. The hours dragged as I sat in the hotel hallway, my mind torn between rage and heartbreak. Every laugh, every smile Casey had ever given me now felt tainted, counterfeit. I couldn't bring myself to leave. I had to confront her. I had to make her face what she had done to me, to us. The hallway grew quieter as the evening deepened. Eventually, I made my way to her room. My hands trembled as I knocked softly, masking my voice. "Room service," I said firmly. The muffled sounds of moaning and movement immediately stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, and then footsteps approached. The door opened, and there he was, Casey's boss, Richard. His shirt was unbuttoned, and his hair was disheveled. He glanced at me with a confused look, clearly about to say, "We didn't order anything." Before he could finish the sentence, my fist connected with his face. The impact sent him reeling backward, crashing to the floor. His expression went from shock to pain in an instant, and he clutched his nose as blood began to seep through his fingers. I stepped over him without a second thought, my focus entirely on finding her. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I stormed into the suite, scanning for the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I shoved it open. There she was, my Casey. The woman I had vowed to love and cherish stood in the middle of the room, completely naked, clutching a sheet to her chest. Her green eyes, once so warm and inviting, now stared at me wide with shock and fear. Beside the bed was a tripod-mounted camera, its red recording light blinking mockingly at me. "Well, hello, Casey," I said, my voice dripping with icy venom. "So this is what a business trip looks like?" She stammered, trying to wrap the sheet tighter around herself. "Jim, it's not what you think. I can explain." "Oh, you can explain?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You can explain the camera, Richard, and how your clothes ended up on the floor? Go ahead, Casey. Make it make sense." As she opened her mouth to reply, Richard staggered into the doorway behind me, still holding his bleeding nose. "Look, man," he began, his voice muffled by the blood. "I know how this looks, but—" I didn't let him finish. I turned and hit him again, this time in the stomach. He doubled over, groaning, and collapsed onto the carpet. Casey rushed forward, still clutching the sheet around her, trying to intervene. "Stop it, Jim. Please. Let me explain." I grabbed her by the wrist, my grip firm but not painful, and locked eyes with her. Her once vivid green eyes were filled with tears now, but I felt no pity. "I'm not your husband," I said coldly. "Your husband died the moment you betrayed him. You killed him with what you've done." I released her wrist and shoved her backward onto the bed. She sat there, stunned, as tears streamed down her face. "Jim, please," she sobbed. "I love you. It's not what you think. It was a mistake." I laughed bitterly. "A mistake? Casey, a mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. Sleeping with your boss, recording it, and lying to me about it is a betrayal. And it's unforgivable." Behind me, Richard groaned as he tried to stand. His voice was strained. "Let's just calm down, man. This is getting out of hand." That was all it took to snap what little control I had left. I lunged at him, pinning him against the wall. My fists found their mark repeatedly, each punch fueled by the rage and devastation coursing through me. He struggled, trying to push me off, but I was relentless. His attempts to defend himself grew weaker with each blow. Blood smeared across his face and the hotel wallpaper as he slid to the floor, gasping. "Stop!" Casey screamed, rushing toward me. I ignored her, my focus entirely on the man who had helped destroy my life. He tried to crawl toward the door, but I grabbed him by the collar and dragged him into the hallway. "Where are you going?" I growled. "We're not finished." The commotion had drawn the attention of the other guests. Doors began to open, and curious faces peeked out into the hallway. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as they took in the sight of me, bloodied knuckles raised, and Richard. A broken mess on the floor. "Somebody call security," a woman shouted. But I didn't stop. I was too far gone. The man managed to get to his feet and stumbled toward the elevators, but I tackled him before he could escape. We hit the ground hard, rolling across the hallway floor. I landed on top of him and wrapped my hands around his throat, squeezing as he clawed at my wrists. "Jim, stop it. You'll kill him." Casey screamed, her voice shrill with panic. Hotel security arrived seconds later, pulling me off him with considerable effort. I struggled against their grip, still consumed by rage. "He deserves this," I yelled. "You don't understand what he's done." By the time the police arrived, I had calmed down enough to explain what had happened, or at least my version of it. Casey stood off to the side, wrapped in a bathrobe, her face streaked with tears. Richard was barely coherent, holding an ice pack to his swollen face. The police officers quickly took control of the scene, separating us and trying to make sense of the chaos. One officer approached me, his tone firm but professional. "We need to take you to the station for questioning," he said. "Fine," I replied, my voice hollow. "But you're taking him too. He's not innocent in this." Another officer cuffed Richard, who whimpered in protest but didn't resist. As we were both escorted toward the elevators, I glanced back one last time at Casey. Her eyes were filled with tears, her expression a mix of guilt and despair. But I felt nothing. The ride to the station was silent, save for the hum of the police car engine. I stared out the window, my hands cuffed in my lap, trying to piece together what my life had just become. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed faintly, adding to the tension of the room. I sat on a cold metal bench, the cuffs now removed, staring at the tiled floor. Across from me, Richard slumped in his chair, his face swollen and bruised. Casey sat further down the hallway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes red from crying. One of the officers finally approached me, clipboard in hand. "All right, Mr. Lawson, here's the situation. Looks like this was a case of, domestic issues that got out of hand. You'll both be charged with disorderly conduct and fined for the disturbance. No one's pressing assault charges." I exhaled sharply. "So that's it?" "That's it," the officer confirmed, his tone neutral. "Pay the fine, and you're free to go. But next time, settle your family matters somewhere other than a hotel hallway." He handed me the paperwork, and I quickly signed, eager to leave. They'd already processed Richard, who was now slumped by the exit, holding a damp cloth to his face. Casey hadn't moved. I was the first to leave. The station doors swung open, and the cool night air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I saw her. Casey stood near the entrance, her arms wrapped around herself, her hair messy, and her makeup smeared. She looked small, fragile even, but I couldn't let myself feel anything for her anymore. "Jim," she started, her voice shaking. I raised a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," I said coldly. "Don't even try." Her lips quivered, but no words came out. "You can't come home," I continued, my voice steady but filled with icy finality. "My lawyer will send you the divorce papers. You can sign them and move on. As for your things, I'll ship them to your parents. Let them see the kind of daughter they raised." Tears welled up in her green eyes, but I didn't care. "Jim, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let me explain." No," I interrupted, taking a step closer. "You couldn't control yourself. You had everything, a home, a husband who loved you, a good life. And you threw it all away for what? For him? For Richard?" She flinched at his name, but I pressed on. "You destroyed us, Casey. There's nothing left to explain." She opened her mouth to speak, but I wasn't finished. "And you can tell your lover something else," I said, my voice low and venomous. Her tear-streaked face looked up at me, confused. "What?" "Tell Richard this isn't over," I said. "You tell him that I'll do everything in my power to make sure he loses everything he has. His money, his reputation, his job, everything." "Jim, don't," she began, but I cut her off again. "I don't care what you think anymore, Casey. This isn't about you. It's about him. He ruined my life, so I'll ruin his. I have connections, tax auditors, regulators, you name it. I'll have his company under so many investigations, they won't know which way is up." My voice grew colder, sharper. "And when I'm done, he'll wish he'd never met you. So go ahead, tell him. Tell him he's going to lose everything." Casey stood there, stunned. as if my words had physically struck her. She shook her head slowly, tears falling freely now. "Jim, please," she tried again. But I had nothing more to say. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there alone in the cold night. I went back to the hotel, grabbed my suitcase, and booked the earliest flight home. Sitting at the airport terminal, I felt a deep sadness settle over me, heavier than anything I'd ever carried. It wasn't just the loss of my wife. It was the loss of the life I thought we had. The plane ride home was quiet, giving me too much time to think. I stared out the window as the city lights disappeared below, and I whispered to myself, "Not everything that glitters is gold." When I arrived home, the house felt eerily empty. Casey's things were still there, but they no longer felt like part of my life. I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, staring at the divorce lawyer's business card I'd pulled from my wallet. This wasn't the end I'd imagined for us, but I knew I couldn't let it break me. Life had thrown me into a dark chapter, but I had to believe the story wasn't over yet. Even in the blackest storm, the sun waits on the other side. I whispered to myself. I took a deep breath, set the empty glass on the table, and leaned back against the cushions. The house was quiet, almost unbearably so, but somewhere deep inside, a small ember of hope flickered. This was just one battle. My life wasn't over.